Mr. Speaker, for one, for more than an hour, I really thought we were dealing with the National Economic Fund. That is what I thought we were dealing with, because provisions are made within this current piece of legislation to capitalize the Sovereign Wealth Fund, if necessary, by the National Economic Fund. But the member went on and on, Mr. Speaker, as though we were dealing with the National Economic Fund, and was audacious enough, Mr. Speaker, to have said, why is it that we are having or introducing a sovereign wealth fund when we have a National Economic Fund subsisting? Well, you see, Mr. Speaker, it is the same question I would have asked him in 2017. Because in 2017, and he kept talking about a meeting of 2018, but the draft is 2017. Ipokote bien ni 6 mois, il y a élection, il te hani on loi pour passer, même qu'on nous ka passer hodia, mais ça nous imprime. Et mais 6 months after, when the National Economic Fund was already in place. You know, Mr. Speaker, when people wear different hats, they see things differently with a certain degree of dishonesty or disingenuity. Because the Sovereign Wealth Fund is not new. In 2017, the member was Prime Minister. The member was Prime Minister when he attempted to introduce the very Sovereign Wealth Fund, which he now is discounting because of the existence of the National Economic Fund, which was there at the time already. So what's the difference now? The difference now is because he's no longer Minister of Finance. That is the difference, and I'll tell you why. I will point you to the variances, Mr. Speaker, of what currently obtains and what was proposed in 2017. He keeps talking about, Mr. Speaker, the board and transparency and safeguards. Mr. Speaker, I love transparency, but it is that very member who at a summit of the Americas meeting said that when transparency is so cumbersome, and permit me to paraphrase, when it is so onerous, you can dispense with it. Today he's bold enough to talk about transparency. I want to jog his mind again, Mr. Speaker. The National Economic Fund, when it was passed, it was mandatory that the Minister of Finance comes to Parliament to get approval to spend out of that economic fund. He led, Mr. Speaker, the amendment to that legislation, which no longer makes it necessary in the interest of accountability and transparency to come to Parliament to get approval. And today he talks about transparency and accountability. Mr. Speaker, I've never heard those kinds of nonsensical arguments. I've never heard of them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the board a bit, very quickly. The board. And let's look at what obtains in this act. In this act, Mr. Speaker, Section 6. The board, and there are various qualifications. A holder of a degree in economics, finance, accounting, law, or relevant degree, has over 5 years experience, has over 10 years post-qualification professional experience. That is what currently obtains to become a member of that board now. His board, in 2017, Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what the proposal was insofar as the board is concerned. Persons of recognized integrity, competence, in finance. Who is competent in finance? That is subjective, Mr. Speaker. It is subjective. The law now is objective, and that is something that can be determined as a matter of fact, not as a matter of opinion. Represent the diversity of persons, are not members of the civil service, are not convicted of a crime. So even the former member of Castries Southeast could have been on the board because they have not been convicted of a crime, with no kind of qualifications. And for him to stand here today, Mr. Speaker, for him to stand here today and to denounce and to criticize a piece of legislation which replaces that with professionals is disingenuous. That is what it is, Mr. Speaker. And he goes on, Mr. Speaker, he talks about the minister. The minister. Mr. Speaker, I want to refer, and I can make it a document of the House, the draft 2017 Sovereign Wealth Fund Act, which was tabled while the member was Prime Minister. And it says here, Mr. Speaker, and I want you to listen carefully, interpretation under section 2, and it goes on to describe the fund. At 2A, it says it describes a joint venture agreement. Hear this well, St. Lucians. Moi v'les écouter bien. And we will compare that with what obtains now. An agreement between the government and a statutory body, or other public contracting authority, and a private party. A private party. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It goes on to say, his draft legislation goes on to say, public resources may be transferred or made available to private parties. Moi vle di sa kweyol. Moi vle di sa kweyol. His draft legislation said, Mr. Speaker, that the assets of the government and the people of St. Lucia could have been transferred into private hands. That is what it said, Mr. Speaker. And the minister means minister responsible for finance. So when you see that, Mr. Speaker, when you see that you were giving the board authority to take public assets and transfer it to private hands right away, the Dahemol fiasco must jump to the fore. The DSH deal must jump to the fore. That Wipe thing must jump to the fore. Cabot. And the list goes on and on. Giving yourself authority to take public assets and vest in a private party. And hear this, Mr. Speaker. Hear this. Part 1 of his proposed Sovereign Wealth Fund 2017. Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia, establishment, vesting, and trusteeship of Sovereign Wealth Fund of St. Lucia. Section 3, Clause 3 rather. There is an establishment to be known as the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Hear this well, Mr. Speaker. The ownership of the fund is vested in the Crown with the minister acting as trustee. Moi vle di sa patwa. Moi vle di sa patwa. Actuellement nous ka mette législation en place. Nous ka di ko sa nous pa ka pou bagay gouvernement ek bay pièce kalte mouni. Nous pas ka bay pièce individuelle, nous pas ka bay pièce compagnie, nous pas ka servi bagay gouvernement comme ça. Ça yo teni, c'est ou ça point propriétaire c'est ici. Ou ça point propriétaire gouvernement et ou ça mette et transfer à la main genre privé. You know, and going on to say, Mr. Speaker, that the minister is the trustee of the funds. Can you imagine? So the very billions of dollars to which he speaks, Mr. Speaker, if he is the trustee as Minister of Finance, Balfini Vieloansa. So that is what he's afraid of, and that is the kind of dangerous provisions that your proposed act contain. Trustee of the funds. Trustee. And you can transfer any property. It is no wonder, Mr. Speaker, that we lost the Dahem Hall. We lost the Dahem Hall, valued at $60 million, transferred, registered in the name of a private party, and up to now, government coffers have not been credited with 1 penny. But that is the kind of mischief, Mr. Speaker. That is the kind of mischief that they had created, or they wanted to create. But Mr. Speaker, it is a totally different bill now in terms of transparency, accountability, the custodians of the funds, etc., etc. Why are you taking the Economic Fund Board and making such a comparison to a totally different thing? The Economic Fund, Mr. Speaker, is raised by persons with qualifying investments. You must qualify under the CIP legislation. That has nothing to do with our sovereign wealth fund. It is only after you qualify, the Minister of Finance can say, okay, we are heavy there, let me put some money over there for bad weather, so to speak, Mr. Speaker. And when you tell me, and you keep talking about the other meeting in 2018, nomla poko te même vin office, even office J 2016, late janvier 2017, ite haniba isa koy kabay koy pouvoir pour poué bagay gouvernement ek meya la me pouvi. And we saw it happen. We saw it happen even without that legislation, Mr. Speaker. We saw it happen. We saw it happen with Cabot. We saw it happen with T.O.A. King and DSH. We saw it happen with the Dahem Hall. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, sometimes when you listen to persons who believe that they profess to be intelligent, they really are not, Mr. Speaker. They really are not. And this is nothing short of a piece of legislation, as the Prime Minister quite adequately explained, to create generational wealth and to ensure that in the event there is a catastrophe, natural or otherwise, that we don't have to depend on CDB or IMF or all of those institutions, most of which take an extraordinary length of time to respond to your emergencies. So we have money at our disposal to deal with our business at home, Mr. Speaker. When I hear all that kind of nonsense, Mr. Speaker, I felt it was necessary that, one, he introduced his sovereign wealth fund long before ours. Two, he gave himself all the authority to transfer property into private hands. Three, that is not permitted under the new legislation. Four, the way the board is selected, it's a board of professionals. He just talked about once you don't have a conviction and anybody else. So anything else. So, Mr. Speaker, you are dealing with chalk and cheese here. And I have to say, given the purposes of this fund, I have absolutely no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that it will meet its purpose. And in the next 10 years or so, all of us would have relished the opportunity of being part of this debate that would ensure that the security of St. Lucia and our ability to respond to natural disasters that were unforeseeable, we can meet the responses with minimal delay, Mr. Speaker. And sometimes, in a lot of instances, you need that to bring the country back to a degree of normalcy. So, with this short contribution, Mr. Speaker, I rest my case with total support for the bill. Thank you.